Welcome to City Club Missoula's December Forum, Missoula Writers on Writing, History, and Storytelling. I am Julie Maloney, and I have the honor of serving as the chair of the City Club Missoula's Board of Directors. Thank you all for being here today. City Club's mission is to bring people together to inform and inspire them on issues vital to the community through public forums that encourage the discussion of new ideas and the free exchange of thought. We have a deep commitment to civility and civil discourse, even when we discuss challenging issues. Before introduction, some thank yous. Thanks to Missoula Community Access Television, which records our forums as part of their media assistance grants to nonprofit organizations. MCAT serves our community on cable channels 189 and 190. MCAT occasionally live streams our forums on its local live platform as well. You can find videos of past CCM forums by clicking the video button on our website, cityclubmissoula.com. Many thanks to our sponsors, especially those at the executive level. They are Blackfoot Communications and First Security Bank. Our executive level sponsors are key partners in helping to expand audience access and reliably planning and conducting our forums. We are grateful to all our sponsors as well as our members, and we invite you to join them. Thank you also to our board of directors and our administrator, Jenny Rohrbach. On behalf of City Club Missoula, we acknowledge that we are in the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people. Today, we honor the path they have always shown us and caring for this place for the generations to come. We are grateful to share this special place with our neighbors and friends. Our speakers for today's panel are Debra, Magpie, Earling, and Peter Stark. Debra is the author of the novels Perma Red and the Lost Journals of Sacagawea. She is the recipient of the Montana Governor's Arts Award and has received both a Guggenheim and NEA Fellowship. Other awards include the American Book Award and the Spur Award. She retired from the University of Montana, where she was named Professor Emeritus in 2021. She's a member and citizen of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. She's Bitterroot Salish. Peter describes himself as an adventure historian. Born in Wisconsin, he attended Dartmouth College and the University of Wisconsin and set out to write adventure travel articles about Greenland, Tibet, and elsewhere for magazines such as Outside, Smithsonian, and the New York Times Magazine. Based in Montana and having lived with his family in Mozambique and Brazil, he now specializes in researching and writing historical accounts of early American explorers in wilderness settings and their contact with indigenous peoples. His book, Astoria, was a New York Times bestseller, and his Young Washington named finalist for George Washington Book Prize. His most recent book was published by Random House in August, titled Gallop Toward the Sun. I know I'm going to scoot. Tecumseh, thank you. I even looked it up, and then I forgot it as soon as I got up here. Thank you. And William Henry Harrison's Struggle for the Destiny of a Nation. I will hand it off to you two, and we'll be back at the break.
Great. Okay, there we go. Well, thank you so much, Julie and City Club, for having us. I've been really looking forward to this. First, it was going to be with Michael Punk, as some of you know, and he and I have gone way back as writers. But then he canceled, I think, I don't know when. And Debra would have been the first person I would suggest, and I didn't even have to suggest her that the organizers tracked her down, and she agreed to come here on the kind of a more spur of the moment. But I just wanted to read you. Debra and I have been emailing back and forth a little bit about questions we might ask each other, and she sent me an email this morning about thanking me for my questions, and then I just have to read this because I think it's really charming, and I think it tells a lot about Debra. She says, look, City Club had two adventurous modern-day swashbucklers who've had marvelous journeys and forays into the unknown, and now they have, well, me. I'm not very entertaining, I'm afraid. I truly am Debbie Downer on any lighthearted topics. I'm terrible at parties and dinner conversations. I don't sparkle. I dimly glitter like the glitter-swaddled heads of the Clutter family, but I'll try to keep my chin up. Okay. You can leave right now, and you've got the audience. But should I? Do you want to respond, or I could start with a question?
Well, Peter asked me, well, who are the Clutter family? And if you recall, in Cold Blood, there was a really graphic and morbid description of the Clutter family in their coffins with their glitter swaddled heads. And I thought, see, my light conversation has already begun. So Peter had some interesting questions, I think. And so I'm going to start and kind of turn the question on him. And he asked, what is an example of your very earliest and very latest writing? Yeah.
Okay, it's turned back on me. Okay, that's fine. When I was coming up with that question for Debra, I thought, what is my earliest writing? And I remember, I don't know, I must have been like 5 or 6 or something. I mean, pretty young. And waking up one morning at our house in Wisconsin and thinking, I really want to write a story. And it was just like this kind of compulsion. And so I got a piece of paper, and it turned out, I thought it was like a big book-length tablet. It turned out, because my mom saved it, it's a little piece about that big. And I started writing, and I thought I'd written this story. And, it felt good. And then years later, I came across that in a scrapbook. And so there's this little piece of notepaper like you have your grocery list on. And it starts, once there was a ghost. And then there was a dagger with blood dripping off. And that was it. And so that's my earliest piece of writing. And that I think, I always love hearing origin stories from anyone, about anyone, writers in particular, and I hope Debra's going to give us some of hers. But that part of what happened is that my father really loved to write, and he really admired writing. And he was way into history, and way into frontier history. In fact, the bedroom where I grew up, it was in where I wrote my first story, was in an actual Swedish settler's cabin from 1848, where you could still see the axe marks on the wall. And so that was the world I grew up in, and he loved writing about frontier history. So I kind of had that compulsion come to me, and then I was sort of a math and science guy, and then eventually in high school I got into poetry, and I was always a reader, and then one thing led to another through a long and difficult series of events, and I eventually went to grad school in journalism at the University of Wisconsin, and then decided I wanted to go somewhere remote to start my journalism career, either in the center of a big city or way out somewhere. And so I was looking for jobs in Alaska and Southeast Asia, and I was coming back from Alaska on a train from Seattle that came through Montana, and I thought, wow, this is pretty remote. So I got off the train. This is absolutely true. And I called an editor at the State Journal in Wisconsin, where I'd been working in Madison, and which is a lead paper. And this editor had worked in Montana, and I called him, like from the train station. Hey, I'm in Montana. I'm looking for a newspaper to go to. Where should I go? He said, oh, go to Missoula. If you like Madison, you'll love Missoula. So I came down here and knocked on the door of the Missoulian, and the rest is history. So that's my first piece, and then my most recent is this. I'm as the biography said, I've been really interested in early explorers and first contacts with indigenous people. So now I'm writing, after my Tecumseh book came out in August, I'm researching a book about Coronado and a search for the 7 cities of gold, and the Puebloan Indians who not only resisted him, but essentially broke his spirit and sent him home on a litter. So I'm working on that one. So, okay, Debra.
We have parallel journeys, which is surprising. When I was in the 7th grade, I went to parochial school in Spokane, and Sister Victor Mary asked for a Halloween story. And so she said, but you have to stop at the place where it's most intense in the story. You have to stop and leave us on a cliffhanger. So I'd been reading those. Do you remember those old books that they used to have? They were like, my mother used to, they were like ghost stories, but they were like little signet classics. And so I'd spent all summer reading reading these books and, sitting by the beach and reading these books. And so I knew how they went. And so a lot of my classmates stood up and they read their stories, and they went something like this. The witch is flying through the night sky. The pumpkins are on the fence. And a ghost jumps out of behind the tree. And I thought, oh, geez, that's boring. And so what's scary about that? And so I started with, my husband and I moved from a small farm in Vermont. And then it stopped. My cliffhanger was this woman running, and I thought this was so original. This woman running in her nightgown, and she falls. Something's chasing her. It's a ghost. She falls, and her night screams. And I thought, oh my God, this is original. Pierce the cold hair around her. And so that was like, I just remember that was the first time that I looked out at a group of people having read something, and I thought, I'm a writer. Like, it was just like, because they were all like, and then everybody after me tried to come up with something that was compelling, and they couldn't, because I had, I was up on it. What's interesting now, after all my stories, I'm coming back to the ghost story or the haunted story, and I'm working on kind of I wanted to, after the Lost Journals of Sacagawea, which is such a dark journey, I wanted to come back to, I wanted to write about boarding schools, as if that isn't like a dark journey. Yeah, let's cheer you all up with just a little boarding school story. But I chose to have an 11-year-old narrator who goes to what I call Saintson Boarding School in up at St. Ignatius, and it's been integrated. So it was the Ursuline boarding schools were integrated. My sister and my brother both went to the boarding school, but I make it a high school and 2 sisters, and the younger sister is precocious and really smart and gets placed into high school when she's 11 years old. So she could have been placed above her sister, who's a junior, but they didn't want to embarrass her sister. So it's a story about witches. And I didn't know at the time when I started, I knew that there are witches in my community, or people who use medicine for bad, scary people. But I didn't know that the Ursulines until I did some research. I found out that the Ursuline nuns were charged with witchcraft in the same year that the Salem witch trials were going on. And when I was doing the research about that, here's something that's really interesting. Okay, so there are these nuns in, I think it's Rouen, France, and they were, they charged this very handsome priest with I don't know, whatever it was. They said he was in cahoots with the devil, but they were actually in cahoots with the devil. So all these nuns kind of charged this priest, and he was burned at the stake. And then these women would come out and give a show, and people came from all over the country for this show that they gave. And they would come out and they would begin with this, which I thought was really curious. Their heads would hit the front of their chest and the back of their backs. They'd flop like this and go with such, and this is what it said, with such rapidity that people became ill watching them, just slapping their heads back and forth. Okay, and so I was looking across the pond at Salem. The young children, there were also an account that used the same description. their heads move back and forth and slap the front of their chest and the back of their chest with such rapidity. The same phrase, so across the pond. So anyway, right now I thought, after all this long journey, I've come back into Sister Victor Mary's classroom and I'm trying to scare everybody, but in the meantime, I'm scaring myself. But I love, but I love that you also started with a ghost story and a dagger.
Yours was way more accomplished than mine. I can reassure you.
Well, I was in the 7th grade.
Well, I can just pick up something right here that, I've got prepared questions, but I just going off of what you're saying is really interesting. I was going to say, the question was going to be, what came first, the desire to be a writer or the compelling need to write? And, I think in both our cases, it was the latter.
Yeah.
And so, but because I do write nonfiction, and now I used to write first-person present nonfiction. Now I write historical nonfiction, and that to hear you talk about the Ursuline, sisters, that's exactly what I do, kind of all day long, and digging into this, and they're just these bizarre things that you would never expect, and it's almost like there's always a story there, if we go deeper and deeper and deeper, and these weird connections, and it's just like, wow, human history is really bizarre and sometimes. So that's I love that story, Where was that, the Ursuline sisters in burning the priest at the stake?
In France.
Okay, all right, okay.
Yeah, in the same year. Isn't that, I don't know, and I know what you mean when you, one of my friends who's a fiction writer, Adrienne Heron, who wrote A Man Came Out of the Door in the Mountain, and she's written other books, other novels. She said to me, well, what's your interest in, because my next realism book is going to be on Jim Thorpe and Marianne Moore, and she said, why are you writing about real people? Why don't you invent these people? And I thought, well, I kind of do invent these people, but it's so interesting to begin to just sit with history for a while. You just sit with history. You don't have to be a historian. You don't have to be an anthropologist. But if you just sit with history for a while and begin to read between the lines and begin to ask questions like, well, what was happening with this? Why would this be that way? Well, where was Sacagawea when these men, 34 men, were coming up in their pirogue and they stopped to watch grizzly bears copulate? Where was she during that time? Pretty frightening kind of stuff when you're a young woman. So things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so and that actually it kind of keys into the next question I had, which we don't have to address directly, but because you have so much experience in both writing fiction and nonfiction, what in the creative process, which is kind of what we're talking about here. How would you, what's the difference? What's the difference about the process or the dynamic?
I think that's a fascinating question. I'm not sure for me there is a difference because I try to inhabit someone. You're trying to inhabit a character, and when I invent a character, they're made up of little bits of things that I witness and see, and so they're a composite of characters. And I've had people in Permared say, oh my God, I know that. I know Baptiste Yellowknife. I know who he is. That's good, because he's just kind of a composite of all these things. And I think when I look into somebody like Sacagawea, or, you try to inhabit someone, and you try to think about what would they be thinking, or emotionally, how would they respond to something? So when they have that old question, write from what you know, I just use that emotional response. Like if I were this age and I were in this situation, what would that feel like?
Do you feel you can write about someone response, someone who you wouldn't know, or someone that you wouldn't necessarily inhabit naturally?
You know what? And that's what I love, right? The fun part is that you begin to take on characters. For example, Marianne Moore, who was at the Carlisle Indian Boarding School, in the early 1900s, and she occupied the same space as Jim Thorpe. So trying to get into her mind, and I thought, I'm not going to write from Jim Thorpe's perspective. I'm going to write from Marianne Moore's. And Marianne Moore was, very educated, very erudite. She was considered the greatest poet of the 20th century. The greatest poet of the 20th century meets the greatest athlete of the 20th century, and they're at Carlisle Indian School, which is one of the most atrocious and sort of egregious, had most egregious policies toward Native Americans, and she was a suffragette. So what was she thinking? Like, just sit with that character for a while, sit with her poetry, and what is she saying in this? So, and I love that sort of taking on these, because I'm terrible with critical theory and looking into what Marianne Moore might have wanted or what she was trying to accomplish. But when I sit with that, I think, well, here's her story, so could it be this? And I think that's the part of it, isn't it? When you begin to explore your work or these characters, how do you go about inhabiting them?
It's so funny to listen to this because there's again parallel and different techniques in a way. But when you say immersing yourself in history, I'll find an interesting story or period or whatever. It's always more random and intense than that. But kind of immerse myself in it, and then as you say, as you get more and more familiar with that, those events or that piece of history, whatever you want to call it, those people, you really do start reading between the lines because those lines of history. Between each line is about 20 years, an incredible amount of human emotion and events and all sorts of stuff that's not there. And so that's what I find really fascinating, is to try to sink myself in there and come to the human dimension, which is essentially what you're doing. But I'm constrained by facts, nonfiction, and so. Which is, problem. But, and when I do inhabit a character, which I don't do very much, but when I do, I try to say, it's like, I'm just wildly guessing what this character might feel. I mean, or this historical figure, would he have felt like that? Would he have felt like that? Would she have felt like that? It's a question, it's not a statement. But that you're talking about, these scraps of pieces and whatever fact, that's exactly the term I use. I take scraps of reality, and I've been writing nonfiction a long time, and including news way back when, and it's like taking all these scraps of reality and assembling them into something that makes sense, into a story. And sometimes I compare it. This has a good native parallel. Sometimes I compare it to like making a quilt out of kind of random pieces of fabric, but finding a pattern. My quilt would be like really long and skinny because I try to have a narrative story, but it's taking these pieces and you discard a lot of them, most of them, 99% of them, but then there's certain ones that fit into a pattern and then shape that into something that makes sense as a story.
Okay, I'm gonna challenge you a little bit here.
Do it.
Because I think it was kind of like, well, I love that. Well, I deal with facts here, and I was
okay.
No, and I was thinking, okay, haven't you read okay, Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grant is he's a journalist, and then what is it? That Eric Larson, who considers himself a historian, and then you're reading some of his work, and it has, The Devil in the White City, and The Devil in the White City, and I was like, okay, what part of this is really nonfiction, because he's in the head of the killer, as he's like stalking these women going down the grocery store hall or whatever, and I thought, oh, come on, we're probably writing the same thing, I just call mine fiction. But I think there's so many things that, when we're looking at some of these events, I think one of the things that maybe that you and I are really parallel on is how you create the atmosphere of a story and the events around, history has, certain eras of like atmospheric eras. And if I say the Titanic, like that creates kind of this almost a weird kind of nostalgia and fear and the smell of sea and, like withered objects in, museums and that kind of the leathery kind of scent of something, pale blue, aquamarine colors. I mean, it has this whole sort of like almost sensory event for everyone. So I always try to figure out, like, when I'm writing something, what is the atmosphere of this piece? Like, how am I going to bring in my readers? How am I going to bring in myself? I didn't know that when Jim Thorpe went to the Swedish Games, so was that 1914, was it? It was 3 months after the Titanic had sunk. So he had to take a ship across there, and I thought, oh, that changes the way that you look at somebody getting on a ship and going somewhere. Like, oh, it changes it dramatically. But you wouldn't really think that. And I haven't seen that. I just was trying to think, when were those events? And, so all of those things are kind of the fun kinds of things that you can kind of throw together in ways that suggest a certain or particular reality.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I'll address first your first point and then your second one about that. Like Eric Larson and The Devil in the White City. I don't think I've ever read that book, or maybe I read a little bit of it.
Oh, it's a read.
It's okay. It's a read, but and that's something I wrestle with all the time, is because that how much license if you're writing history. I mean, you can make the same argument with journalism, but that's a whole different world. If you're writing history, how much license do you have to, for instance, inhabit the murderer's mind? Which is, I wouldn't kind of remotely think of doing that as a historian, at least in any way, without saying, like, what was he thinking? And for me, it's a really fine line and a difficult line to walk to make the characters alive and vivid and interesting while still staying really true to the facts. Because I have my books have like 1,000 endnotes, citations in them, nailing down just about everything. And so, yet there's always that fine line of doing just what you're saying. It's like, wow, here's this. There's something going on in this guy's head, and obviously. But anyway, there are ways of getting at it without just like diving in there headlong. But the second point about the Titanic going down, that's so true. I mean, painting the atmosphere, and I think for anyone who's writing, if you can find like this certain, in any kind of writing, I mean, it's really useful. And just certain small details that have this really kind of pungent essence to them, that small details that paint a big picture. And I remember, I think Peter Matheson he was here years ago. I think it was in something he wrote, but he said that he strives very much to do what you're talking about, is paint the atmosphere, kind of the colors and the feel and the smell of a place. And he mentioned, the example he gave, as I recall, he said, well, I remember how St. Petersburg feels in 1887, long after I've forgotten the plot of the brothers, or of, who's the crime and, who's the axe murderer? Crime and Punishment. Yeah.
I always get asked these questions, like, what? It suddenly comes a test of what what your literary knowledge is. I always fail doing it.
Yeah. So, here's one. Sentimentality. Because have I ever, been going into sentimentality, and as a writer of nonfiction with kind of a journalist training, any bit of sentimentality is instantly like the journalism red flag goes up and says, hey, you can't do that. And so it's almost been my problem to figure out how to get more sentimental in my writing over the years.
What is journalistic sentimentality? What would that be? You'd like,
Wow. Well, journalism's so broadly defined. So, you can write essays that would be very sentimental and, creative nonfiction. But I'm not exactly sure how you define that. Now, I have one more question.
yeah.
For you, this one actually resonated with me that I thought might be kind of entertaining.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about an encounter or incident that was so bizarre, so strange, you didn't think anyone would believe you if you wrote it.
All right. This is where it gets dark. Are you ready? It's a trigger warning. It's a trigger warning. When I wrote an essay in Hearth about this with Onyx Smith and Susan O'Connor were the editors. When I was in graduate school, I wanted to be, I was in Cornell, and I wanted to be out in the countryside. I pictured myself in, way out in the country writing. And so my mother was a housekeeper, and so I was friends with the housekeepers. I didn't feel very comfortable at the Ivy League. And I remember telling her, as I was going home for the summer, I was taking my boxes down, I said, boy, when I come back, I'd really like to live in the country. And she said, hey, my brother-in-law, he has a really nice place out in the country. And she goes, here, let me she goes, I'll call him. You take your boxes over there to his house, and then you can go back and check it out. And so I was like, hey, that's a great idea. And she goes, oh, you'll love it. It's so beautiful. And so I drove out to the country. It's like in Groton. Doesn't that even sound, that sounds bad, doesn't it? Groton. And I drive out there, and there's all these stubbled fields around this gorgeous 3-story Victorian house with this big barn behind it. And so this guy comes out, and I thought he would be, I don't know why, I thought he'd be like a kind of a friendly, pudgy little guy or something, but he comes out, and he's got like that greasy hair, and he's smoking a cigarette. He's got really wiry. And he comes out, and I was like, oh, man, I'm in trouble. And then he opens my door, and he goes, come on in. I've been waiting for you. So we get in and I'm young and kind of stupid. And we get into into the kitchen. And first he takes me upstairs and shows me, and I got my keys in between my fingers, and we go upstairs, and he shows me this room, and he goes, this is where you'll be staying. And I'm not kidding, there was these pink diaphanous curtains, and the wind was blowing, it was in the spring, there were moths all over the room floor, I don't know why. It was this big empty room, and I looked out on the fields, and I thought, there is miles and miles to the next house. And we walked down the stairs, and he helped me put my boxes up there, and I thought, I'll never see these boxes again. So we sit down at his kitchen table. He goes, sit down. I thought, well, I really got to be going. I got a class that's going to start. He goes, you have time for a cup of coffee. It's just instant. So he's doing that thing, it's got that weird noise. I kind of love it when somebody ting, 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 when they're stirring their coffee. So he's sitting there, and he's smoking. He looks at me, and he goes, my wife left me about 6 months ago. I was like, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. And he goes, you see, she ran off with my farmhand. And he goes, see that corn chopper back there? And so he goes, through the window over by the barn. So there's this big machine. I go, see that corn chopper back there? And I was like, oh, yes. And he goes, well, it has a tendency to stick. And he said, so I was doing my chores out in the back field, and he was working at the corn chopper, and I come around. I was like, yeah. And he goes, he must have kicked it with his boot because it pulled him right up into the corn chopper, and I found him about halfway up. And I thought, I got to get out of here. This guy has murdered his wife's new boyfriend. He goes, yeah, she still lives down the road. I go, I ain't going to be living here. And I took off, but that's That's one of, like, I never thought, like, when I wrote that, I never thought, who would believe that?
Ooh,
Really?
Yeah, well, I mean, what a perfect setup.
It sounds like I've written some kind of murder mystery or something.
Oh, man, yeah. I'm going to have nightmares tonight. Well, I don't know, how are we doing for time here? We're ready for table? Okay. I was going to tell my Black Mamba story, but I'll save it for the next time around. Okay, I'll tell you. I'll give you the 30-second version. So, Outside Magazine assigns me to go on a tiny little kayak expedition down an unexplored river in Africa, in Mozambique. Think of the movie version of an unexplored river, and that's what it was like. You know, the vines, the crocodiles leaping off the banks, the waterfalls around corners you wouldn't expect. You know, that you just all of a sudden you have to stop right there, otherwise you die. And it went on like that. It was 15 days long. And I thought, I was sure I was going to die. I would have bailed out and walked home, except walking through the forest was going to be way more fatal than staying in the kayak. And we finally got off the river after 15 days, and I'm, like, thank God, I can get back to my wife, and our kids were younger then. And we still have to go through a big hunting reserve to I think we were photographing it with a photographer, and the great white hunter wanted to show us a leopard, and so he was taking us up into the forest. It's like a Land Rover. It didn't have any windshield and it didn't have any doors. It was set up for hunting, and on the back of it, there were like the trackers, African villagers who were trackers, and I was in the front, and the passenger, I was on the left side because it was a British right-hand drive, and we go through a clearing, and then at one point, and then out into the forest and look for the jaguar or set up the trap or whatever we were doing, and then we came back like an hour later, and we were driving through the same clearing, and I looked at this clearing, and it looked different because it was like a sunny day, and it was this little open patch in the forest, and you just don't see, it looked kind of pleasant, and you don't see that around that kind of forest. And yet then I noticed there was like this kind of black stick poking up in the middle of the little meadow, and I thought, that's funny, did that fall out of a tree because it's not windy, where did that stick come from? And so I'm kind of puzzling over it, and the guy, Jamie, driving it, the Great White Hunter, doesn't see it at all. And the little tracks, there are two just little tracks going by, go right past the black stick, and it's on my side of the Land Rover. And as we get closer, I'm looking at this black stick. It's this massive snake that's that high off the ground, and its head is like this, towards me. and he doesn't see it. And so I just, oh shit! And I literally dove under the dashboard, and you hear this kind of wham. And then he stops and all the trackers are going wild in the back, and he stops the Jeep or the Land Rover, and all the trackers start saying, "Mamba, Mamba, Mamba," and it was a black mamba. And he said that had to be like at least 13 feet long to stand up that high. And then the trackers are jumping down, running around, like trying to find it, or I don't know what. And then they point to the side of the Jeep, and right near my leg, there are two scratches down the paint, like that far from me. And so that was a close call after nearly dying 85 times on the river. It was like, and plus there's a huge high-powered rifle right in front of me. We didn't have any guns. I thought, I'm safe now. And then almost lost it there. Anyway.
Thank you. Table Talk is an extraordinarily rich part of every City Club forum, and arguably the gist of why we are here. We will take a few minutes for each table to introduce themselves to one another and produce one question related to the presentations to ask our speakers. A board member with a microphone will come around afterward for a volunteer from each table to ask the agreed upon question. Please refer to the slide for the guidelines regarding Q&A. As I said at the beginning, we are committed to civil discourse, so we ask that you keep your question respectful. We ask that you avoid making statements so we can get to as many questions as possible. We also ask that any members of the media save their questions until after the forum. Our panelists should be able to stick around until after the forum ends. When asking your question, please stand up, introduce yourself, avoid statements, and ask one brief question. Trust me, we've sent out a survey and this is commented on quite frequently. So please, 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 try to avoid statements, one question. Please be respectful of others and do not interrupt while questions are being asked. The board will manage anything they feel needs to be addressed. We have 2 people with microphones that will come to your table to have you ask your question. Please raise your hand to let them know you have a question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Alexandra Volkert, and we were discussing authors or people in Montana that we would like you to write about. And so my question is, have you considered writing about Dan Kemmis, Darcy McNichol, Nancy Russell, C.M. Russell's wife, or Susie Richaud at our table?
You want to go?
Why don't you?
Okay, well, that's interesting. The C.M. Russell wife, that instantly kind of grabs my attention because, again, it's sort of like what you're saying, Jim Thorpe with Marianne Moore there. You don't see that perspective at all. And you know, what's it like to be a wife of a guy who's kind of living a romantic version of the frontier, and how do you have to support that? Dan Kemmis is another one that who definitely deserves to be written about, and I haven't really thought about writing about him, but he's such an interesting guy. I don't think he's written an autobiography, but there's some place for Dan Kemmis in literature. I don't know where or what, but I think there is.
I think Darcy McNichol is fascinating, although I'm really kind of mad at Darcy McNichol and his family because when the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes have the tribal college, they dedicated their library, so it's named after Darcy McNichol and his family, and he was alive at the time, I think, and no one showed up for the dedication ceremony. So I was like, well, that's not very good. So I would have a hard time writing about him or trying to further his, I don't know, they could have sent someone. I mean, if your family if one of your family was, like a library was being dedicated to your name, you'd show up, I would think. Anyway, that's another Debbie Downer, isn't it?
Downer Debbie.
Hi, good morning. Nancy Bevins. So we talked a little bit about when books get adapted to film, and I know both of you are sort of familiar with that, as was Michael. So how do you feel about that, and what can we expect in the future?
You better go. I have some things to say.
Okay. You know, it's been the most difficult journey, I think, for Permared has been. We had a crowdsourcing. We were able to raise a lot of money. There were, we hired, I guess, it's not me, but Lynn Whitfield was able to hire a lot of people. She was able to get some things going here in the state. But it was on, I can say this now, I think it was on Star's desk for, the contracts were going out. It looked like it was going to happen. And then the person who was behind it was stepped down or stepped aside, or we didn't hear anything more. So it's still there. So there's new movement again, and especially with Lily Gladstone and Killers of the Flower Moon. And, you know, originally she had kind of worked with Permared or the people who were acting for that. So I don't know. years ago somebody told me, because I thought, hey, I just like, my book was just option, and they go, good luck with that. And I was like, that's never going to happen. And I thought, well, I'll show you. And it looked like it was going to. I hope it will. There's so many people behind it. And there's, we have, Linwood tried to, she's non-native, but she tried to hire all native people to work, like Ivan and Ivy McDonald, all the people that she could get, all the native people that she could get to work on it. So, with any luck, it'll go forward. Thank you.
Well, I've got something of my own to add to that briefly, but I think more boldly and significantly, I'm channeling Michael Punk right now, and I can almost recount this story verbatim. I mean, word for word, at a different panel a few years ago. In fact, I think it might have been at the Norman McLean Festival, or one of them, that we were on a panel, and he was talking about The Revenant, his novel, which he wrote, I think, in 1999, and it was optioned right away, and by Hollywood, and for not a huge amount of money, but like enough money that it sounded like they were serious about doing something. And then, a few months later, he gets a call from a producer who was a fairly big producer, name brand. And he said, I love it. We're going to make this movie. It's like the best thing I've ever read. We're going to definitely make this. And Michael said, oh, great. Hang up. And then Michael said, I never heard from that guy again. So, that is a metaphor, right? And that's been my experience. That I haven't been that close to getting. Well, he got it made, an Academy Award winner. My book Astoria is very popular out in the Northwest, especially. And a friend, who's now a friend, who was a stranger, but he approached me. He's a Hollywood screenwriter, and he wanted to write a script about Astoria for a television series. And so he's written a pilot, and his name's Tab Murphy. In fact, he was the guy who wrote the screenplay for Gorillas in the Mist. Was nominated for Academy Award. A very good writer. And when I read his, the first page of the script he wrote, I thought, this guy is really good. I mean, you could just see his talent. He knew what he was doing. So, and he, has some connections, but that's been in the works, trying to get it out there for a year and a half. And, it goes forward a little bit, it stalls, it goes forward. So, I mean, at this point, nothing's happened, but we're hoping.
Monica Trinnell, thank you for your work. I have a question.
Thank you for your work.
Yes.
I'd like you to contextualize today's political climate and draw historic parallels. What would you write in 50 years' time about where we are today?
Good one.
I think we're in some pretty dark times now, and what I say is like there's always been a civility in Missoula, and I've noticed that there's like I was sitting at Clyde Coffee with a former grad student, and we were having coffee, and we noticed how many people who were honking their horns at that particular section. I was like, we were talking, and then somebody would honk their horn, and I don't ever remember that happening in Missoula. And I also witnessed a coal roller, like just crossing the street, and this blasting this really wonderful little family that was waiting to look like they were going over to Chow Mamba, and then all of a sudden they were just sputtering, and we were right behind this big truck. And I thought, like, how do we have civil discussions with people, who are on the other side of the line, the political line, and I'm hoping, if I were to write a novel, it would be about maybe a family trying to negotiate, because in my own family I have, extreme Republicans, which is so surprising to me, and in the family I married into. And then I have on the whole other side, left wing. And so just trying to negotiate that, I think, is, how do we come to love one another, to take care of ourselves and our communities? And so I would write a novel about addressing, that through a very particular lens, which is just trying to love our families over the Thanksgiving table. I mean,
Well, that's such a nice place to start. It always seems to be the Thanksgiving table is the epicenter of our time. And Debra has an advantage over me on this part because it's a novel, and so historically, I'm just joking, but what I come to is thinking like these do feel like really dire times, and which I think they are. And yet at the same time, I think back to, okay, what would it have been like to be in the United States during the Civil War, or World War II, or the Depression? And, I lived through the Vietnam era. That was crazy enough. And that was very polarized, but kind of in a different way, more generationally. So, in 50 years, looking back, I certainly hope we get through this, obviously, and that how significant an event or period it will be against the World War II and the Civil War. I don't know. I agree with what you're saying about the Thanksgiving table. It just seems like all those reaching out to other people and those acts of kindness can really make a difference if people are really conscious of doing that. I mean, it's just like in Missoula. I noticed the same thing. Don't honk your horn at somebody walking across the street. If somebody is in front of you in a car, I've come to realize, well, just let them go. I'm not in that big a hurry, And it's just that it's kind of like a mind shift. It feels, and that's what I hope will change.
well, I also think that I wrote an article for the New York Times, and it was about reading Missoula, so understanding this place through Missoula. And so I recommended all these authors. It was supposed to be from my perspective who I recommended, and I got all these like really vitriolic comments in the side, that I was somehow, because I was welcoming people and telling them to come and visit our bookstores and come, just come and enjoy like our, sit by the Clark Fork and read A River Runs Through It. It's a slim novel, you can get through it pretty fast. And I had people like writing these, like I was tone deaf and I didn't understand like the economic climate of Missoula, and and I thought, and they were talking about we're being pushed out of our landscape, and I thought, okay, I'm the daughter of the last, or the great granddaughter of the last recognized chief, Paul Charlo of the Flathead Nation. We were pushed out of the, I know about encroachment and displacement, and I wanted to answer. I thought you got to stop reading the comments now, like just stop. But I think that's kind of. Where it's supposed to be a lighthearted kind of thing about what books do you recommend in Montana and who would you read? And then there was so much, I thought so much blowback, but not just on mine. And, other people were kind of getting the same thing in their communities. But I have, we've all felt that press. I mean, who would have thought that that our houses would skyrocket in such a way that you'd start to be worried. I mean, I just retired, and now I think, holy cow, I didn't retire thinking I'd have to pay this much. And so, for everything, for groceries, for the house, and I think, well, I'd be able to do it. So, I'm not really retired. I'm out on, I'm selling and out on the road. Yeah, keep writing, keep making appointments and seeing, talking to different groups. Because I don't think it is easy for anyone but the wealthiest among us now. So those are great divides when you start having, it's always been the rich and the poor, but when you find yourself further and further from the middle class and into poverty. After you've, I taught at the university for almost 30 years. So those kinds of things I think are really frightening, and they're what people are facing. So.
Great. Hi, Sarah Halverson, and thank you so much for being here. This is a question maybe more for you, Debra. And we're wondering what inspired you to write your book, The Lost Journals of Sacagawea, if I'm saying that correctly. And kind of a two-part piece to that. What inspired the title? Because the title seems like a counterpoint to the journals of Lewis and Clark. And just to add to that, have you had anyone ask you if she really did write journals? I've had a couple people ask me, did she write journals? So there's something about the title, even though it's a novel, that almost seems like there's a nonfiction element to it that some people might interpret. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I feel like I'm talking a lot here. Laura Millen, are you still here? She's not. I would have her stand up because Laura Millen, the director of MAN and Steve Gluckert were responsible for getting me to write The Lost Journals of Sacagawea. They invited me to write a piece that, it was during the bicentennial. There was these native artists who had done all of this artwork, beautiful artwork, and the person who was supposed to write about them pulled out, and so they said, would you write something? Anything, like, would you write about this artwork? And I thought, I have know nothing about art. I'm like a boob of myself, so I, they said, anything you want to write, we'll take. And I sat down and wrote The Lost Journals of Sacagawea in a coffee shop, and it took about, the one that appeared with Peter Koch, it took, overall, the initial piece was about 30 minutes, and it took me about 45 minutes to write the book with Peter Koch. I don't know, something just went right through me. It's interesting, I've done the research now on Sacagawea and have followed that up, and as you probably know, there's two accounts of her life. One is that she died at the age of 23, and the other is that she may have lived to be almost 90 years old. And so, between those, if she did live to be 90, there's an account that on the Wind River Reservation where she found her home and she got away from Charbonneau and had her own life with someone apparently whom she loved, she had written her journals. She was known as Poivre. She'd written her journals and they were lost in a fire at the agency. So at the Indian Agency there on Wind River. What's interesting too is that after I'd written the novel, I was like, okay, bye Sacagawea. I'm like, saying goodbye now. I have other works I want to write. And just as I was doing that, a man named Michael Ferris came up to me and he said, I have something for you. And he handed me his grandfather's letters and his book. And he was the superintendent on the Wind River Reservation. And in this material, it claims that Sacagawea, this is nonfiction, that Sacagawea was alive at that time. So she was in her 80s when he wrote that. There's also letters from him that are from as a superintendent, not only there, but on the Pueblo, in the Pueblos. So this is not a guy who's making up stuff, just like Lewis and Clark weren't making up stuff. So so there is something to that, but I didn't know it at the time that I began writing. But I think there's truth to sometimes when we reach out to fish into the darkness, that it returns with the real thing, with things we can't even imagine.
Hi, I'm Skylar Stark Ragsdale Peter's son. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here.
Yeah, I told him to put me on the spot. Now I'm not, but now I'm scared.
No, I'm just going to ask a question that you guys already touched on when you were talking, just hoping you would discuss it a little bit more. But how do you introduce sentimentality in both fiction and nonfiction? And in the case of nonfiction, how do you do so while staying true to historical facts?
I have to introduce sentimentality. Wasn't it Richard Hugo who said, you have to walk the line, toward sentimentality, or your work is kind of meaningless? And I think that's really true. If your work isn't pressing on something or touching the tender heart of your reader, It really doesn't. I mean, it's kind of flat. Although I have to say, I've certainly met writers who do like incredible sort of their cerebral fiction writers, but it's kind of rare, and they're geniuses. So like, anyway.
Abstract geniuses. Yeah, I agree with what Debra's saying. That and when for a while that I don't know what era, 80s, 90s, like irony was all the rage. Remember, and irony in fiction, it was like it's sort of a denial of sentimentality, a kind of a conscious denial. And so when I think about sentimentality, I think, okay, that means feeling, and feeling of some sort. It's like the question, how much feeling? How little feeling? What feeling? There's just such a range of what could be considered sentimental. But to the question, which I'm finding really hard, I mean, how would you deal with it in nonfiction? And what I try to do is bring the reader into the story so the reader's invested in the story. That the reader is following a story, and the reader feels that there's something at stake personally. The reader's invested in a character or an outcome. And, if you don't do that, I think then it just does become an exercise in abstraction. And I think there are so many different techniques to bring a reader in that way. And, I try to do it more, with bits of fact, or details. I mean, there are many different ways to do it, but I think it's necessary to have that.
What I think about sentimentality too is my own relationship to it shifts. I just gave a reading at Swanee last year, and I decided to read a piece that I resurrected, a piece from Perma Read that I hadn't read in a long time. And it is, after I read it, it's not lighthearted. It was about my mother. My mother identified my Aunt Louise. She was about 15 years old, and the sheriff didn't want to go out to Perma to pick her up. So he drove her, so he picked her up. She was in Dixon, and he picked her up, and he said, your sister was killed in an automobile accident tonight, so I'm taking you to Mission, to St. Ignatius, to identify her body. So I read this piece about what my mother had endured, and this sheriff, and I thought, who would do this to a kid? The sheriff went around what's now Farron's funeral home, and was like shaking the doors because it was 4:30 in the morning or 4 in the morning. He didn't want to wake the undertaker. So he finds a window and opens the window, saddles his hands and pushes my mother through the window and says, and it was like, has the light, his flashlight, and it just happened to be the room where Louise was, on a table. Louise's body was on a table and covered with a sheet. And so, when I read that to the Swanee community, that piece, that it's a, of course, it's a really dark piece, and it has kind of, it was the original ending of Perma Read, but I couldn't get it published because all the editors said, no way, it's too dark. But, when I read that, and even as I'm telling you that, I thought, is this sentimental? Like, have I pushed like such, because it's such a powerful story. And I felt like, I didn't feel good about myself anymore. When I first read it, I thought I was like really brave to write it. And then it shifted for me, and I thought, are there stories sometimes that, when you write them with it, you call up that kind of like really dark, and it felt sentimental to me. Although people told me it wasn't, but for me, it felt like something had shifted in me.
Well, I think in that case, it's almost like you're, I'm trying to think of the verb, but, like catering to the reader's darkest, instincts. It's almost sensationalistic. It's so dark that it's like one of those things that, you couldn't make up.
Yeah.
And so what do you do with it?
Yeah, I'm not sure. So I think those kinds of stories, shift for you and change. I still think they're powerful stories and important to tell, but.
And I also think over the course of, as you were speaking, I was just thinking of the arc of time. But, if you read novels or even newspapers in some cases from 100 or 150 years ago, they're amazingly sentimental. I mean, emotions like splashed all over the place. And compared to where we are now, or compared to where we have been. So, I think that's an arc that changes over time, too. It's like what's considered sentimental.
Hi, I'm Molly Stockdale from Travelers Rest State Park, and I just wanted to ask you, how would you encourage young people today to engage in the act of sitting with history? I think the way that we teach history is a little bit different, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about, especially Debra, having taught for so long. How do you encourage that practice?
Well, you just look at history overall and you think, what would it be like to really be at Custer Battlefield? There's stories about, historians have really done a disservice to stories about women in particular, and I think Calamity Jane is an example of that. And I don't know, it was like, probably about, gosh, time goes by, so about 20 years ago, there was these historians who were calling her a harlot and, just just all these terrible things. And then there's this little book that you can get, this little booklet where it said that she wrote about her own life. And it is so heartfelt and so touching, where she comes from Deadwood as a 16-year-old and hears that her uncle's been killed in the Custers, and his body is still in the field. So she goes through, rides from Belle Fourche. This is her story, rides from Belle Fourche to the battlefield. And I thought, I don't care. And they said, oh, that's just all made up. That's not true. And I thought, well, who's saying this? Why is this not true? And so I think, like, sitting with that story, like, what do you imagine that would be like? And you imagine coming up, after, some of those men were, here's Downer Debbie, they were mutilated, and then the smell coming up over that greasy grass and wondering, are there still Indians around here who can attack me? I'm a 16-year-old girl on a horse. Like, have you ever driven from Belle Fourche to the battlefield? This like goes on and on and on, and you're like looking around. And I thought, I would never be, if my car broke down or I lost my navigation system, I would never be able to find my way without a road here. What would that be like? So I think it's all those things where we ask for people to imagine what history really is, like what it's like to be in certain circumstances, and place yourself in there. And there's so many, I think I'm so surprised that no one wrote about Sacagawea before. For Pete's sake, she was nursing a baby and she was traveling through with really 34 men. And they actually said this, like, they keep saying she never spoke English, or she didn't understand French, and she didn't. I thought, so you expect her to really remember her language after she was traumatized. She speaks Hidatsa. She's in this village, Mandan probably, and so she would have had to have known French just because that was her survival. I mean, if you've ever had to stay some time in France and there's no one around to help you, you learn it pretty fast. I mean, I'm not terrible with languages, and I picked it up in 4 weeks. I could kind of understand what people were saying. So I think, like, when you ask students, to sit with history, pick a character in history and try to imagine what their lives were like. I mean, and then do a little research. And, and it really is. You don't have to be, people are starting to call me a historian. I was like, I'm not a historian. I'm just somebody who is really interested in what the heck was going on. You know, what happened? Do you know that when Sacagawea got back to the Lemhi Shoshone, that she could not contain her joy and her gleefulness and started dancing. She was sucking on her fingers. She saw Papank, who she thought had drowned in the river or didn't make it home, and she saw her people again, and she just could not stop crying. And then Lewis made some well, she didn't show any whit of emotion the whole time. And I thought, because she was scared out of her mind. She had to protect herself and not let you know that she knew what was going on. I mean, just think about it. You would be an absolute dolt, an idiot, if you were traveling with people who are enemies and you didn't pay attention to what they're telling you or saying. So I think that's the kind of thing that's missing in history: exploration and creativity, imagining.
That actually goes right to what I'm thinking, is that that historians, I think, serve a really important role, and there's there are thousands and thousands, millions probably of academic historians in the world, and I think in recent decades, especially, there's been such an emphasis on very kind of esoteric, specific scholarship, and the need to publish professionally, that the part that's really missing is, how do you tell a story to a popular audience or to a younger person in a way that's going to engage them? And I can't read a lot of the academic history that I see in articles. It's just it tends to be, not always, but it can be very dry. It doesn't have a story arc. It doesn't have much character or feeling. And so I think the challenge is, how do you make that history as vivid as possible? And that's been my mission for quite some years, is to try to make the history as vivid as possible while staying true to the events and the facts. And it's not easy, I find, but I think there needs to be much more of that, and also writing about events and circumstances that people can relate to now, or young people can relate to now, or can put themselves in that position, as you were saying about Calamity Jane. But there's a real need to find those stories and to express them in a way that will engage younger people.
And critically think about them.
And critically think about them.
And staying true to City Club, we usually like to have a hard stop at 1 o'clock, so thank you for your time and for sharing your stories. Debra and Peter, we really appreciate you being here today. Again, thank you to our sponsors, especially First Security Bank and Blackfoot Communications. And of course, thank you to you, our audience. We are working on the finishing touches for our January forum. Be sure to check out our Facebook page or website for more details and to register. Happy holidays, everybody.